My presentation on the Strongylocentris drobachiensis, or the green sea urchin. So to start with, the green sea urchins are part of the phylum Echinodermata, which they share with other animals like sea stars, sea cucumbers, brittle stars, and feather stars. One of the most characteristic parts of these different animals is that they all have, or many have, spines or bumps covering the outer surface of their bodies. They also have what's called a water vascular system, which is basically this series of canals that helps them move through hydraulic pressure. And then also they are radially symmetrical with five-sided radial symmetry, which is really obvious on things like sea stars because you have the 5 different arms that come off of it, but in sea urchins it's a little more subtle because their shell or test has 5 different plates, which are all covered by spines, so it's kind of hard to see. They also lack a central nervous system or a brain, but they do have a nerve ring that goes around the inside of their calcium carbonate shell. And then they also have a complete digestive system and a large colon, which we'll talk about later, and separate sexes, which we will also talk about later. They are also part of the class Echinodea, which means, as I said earlier, that sea urchins have that shell or test covered with the small knobs called tubercules and attached spines, which attach to the tubercules. The test protects the soft inside of the body, and both it and the spines are made of calcite. So to move on to some of these identifying features that I'm talking about, they can grow up to 8 centimeters in diameter, but they tend to sit around 55 milliliters or 5 centimeters. They're the smallest of the Pacific Northwest sea urchins, which if you find one that's small and green, it's probably green sea urchin. They have a low profile with a test that's kind of purple to violet or dark green rather than a brighter green, as you can see in this picture. They also have vertical rows of tube feet as dark bands kind of in between the tests, which you can also see on this picture. They also have spines that tend to crowd together really densely that can be anywhere from 1 to 5 centimeters long on your largest sea urchin. The epidermis is covering all of the test and also covers the spines and pedicellari, which we'll talk about a little bit more also. The spines are the longest ones out of all of these other ones. The pedicellari tend to be much shorter. And they also have 5 double rows of podia, which we're going to talk about a lot. You can find them in the low intertidal zone, which is where we found them in class, so they tend to like sheltered or exposed kelp beds and rocky areas, because that's where they'll find most of their food, be able to stay on. They're prey to sea otters, crows, gulls, wolf eels, large fish, sea stars, crabs, and humans. If you've ever had uni or heard of it, that's what that is. They can use their spines to react to outside stimulus, and also their pedicellari to defend themselves, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Their podia also can be used for a lot of different tasks, because they're all suckered, which would then allow them to resist wave action by being able to cling on. They're also a non-invasive species to New England, so in Maine, which is where 98% of all US landings are. They're a big fishing industry, especially starting in late 1987. Kind of as markets expanded for sea urchin. But who eats them? So the sea urchin, as I talked about earlier, has a really extensive digestive system, starting with the pedicellari, and the podia, which kind of help move the food towards the mouth, which is on the bottom. The mouth then passes it into Aristotle's lanterns, which is a little bit similar to like a pharynx in another animal. They have their esophagus with a little loop in it, their small intestine that moves into the large intestine, and then out through the top to the anus. They primarily eat fixed algae, which would make them a primary consumer, but not always, because they also eat gastropods, barnacles, dead fish, diatoms, and detritus, as well as sea squirts, hydroids, and sponges, which makes a lot of sense because that's what we found them eating. And then to move into the podia, which is part of the respiration, they can do there's kind of 3 different main kinds. So there's oral podia, aboral podia, and ambidal podia, which can all kind of do similar tasks, but can also be specialized to do tasks like locomotion, adhesion, feeding, and respiration. So for respiration, we're going to focus on the aboral podia, which have thinner walls and greater exposure to flow, which helps facilitate gas exchange. All of them, though, have 3 layers, which is the outer epithelium, the middle connective tissue, the inner muscular layer, and then all of them are connected to an ampulla, which is a sac-like structure that helps with the movement of these podia. For reproduction, they are all dioecious, which means that they either have male or female reproductive systems, and they spawn by doing broadcast spawning. So eggs and sperm are all released at the same time by all of these different urchins into the water column to eventually form an embryo or a zygote, which then grows through mitosis, becomes a larva called an echinoplute, of which that's kind of just their main plankton larva stage. Specifically, the most important ones to recognize are the prism and the 6-armed Pluteus, because those are kind of the main stages at which they actually have form and function. And then as you move through, eventually that sinks to the bottom, becomes a benthic organism, where it then becomes a juvenile, which is a small adult, which, when it's an adult, it's also a little bit stronger in the test. And then, as for a cute study that I found really interesting, so all animals have mitochondria, which they use for cellular respiration. Mitochondria has its own DNA that's separate from the DNA of the organism itself. So these groups of scientists wanted to figure out how the mitochondrial DNA diversity was happening. So sea urchins are really easy to study. They have broad ranges. They have this plankton form of life where they can drift across the entire ocean. And so they're great study subjects for studying this kind of thing. They extracted a bunch of mtDNA from these 2 kinds of sea urchins, which are the purple sea urchin and the green sea urchin, and did a bunch of different calculations to estimate the degree of sequence divergence and the maximum likelihood estimate. The result of their study was that green sea urchins, as opposed to purple sea urchins, only have 6 kinds of mtDNA, which means that their intraspecific divergence was 0.01%, or 16 out of 21 individuals had the same mitochondrial genotype. In the species, over 80% of the individuals fall into one of 2 genotypes, resulting in lower mtDNA diversity than in most animal species, especially terrestrial ones. This low diversity could mean that green sea urchins are the descendants of a rare migratory group that could predate the past 300,000 year estimate by 3 to 5 million years, which is just really cool. Thank you for listening. These are my references. Thank you.